If you want to get me internally up in arms quickly, you can give me a biblical narrative about heaven and hell that directly suggests that God sends people to suffer in hell. I've spent much of my life trying to counter the narrative that God is someone to be afraid of, along with countering the idea that God arbitrarily punishes people with eternal condemnation. And because of that, I can get rather quickly irritated at scriptures supporting condemnations to hell. Enter this week's gospel lesson, in which a rich man and a poor man die, and the poor man is carried away by angels to be with Abraham, while the rich man is tormented in Hades. Hey, Bible, I'm trying to teach people about loving God because God first loved us, not trying to scare people into conformity. Could you tone it down a little? Okay, obviously not. And getting myself up in arms about a text that, well, it doesn't actually make it go away. So I'm going to have to deal with this story. I can calmly remind myself that it is a parable, and that parables are meant to help us break down our assumptions about how the world works, not be taken literally, and that helps some. I can remind myself that the Jesus Seminar doesn't think this story goes back to Jesus, but rather to Luke, but that doesn't actually do much for me because I find Luke to be a pretty significant teacher in his own right. Or I can let the story stand as it is written, try to put my concerns aside and see what this story can teach as it is, which I'm pretty sure is the best way forward. So, who is Lazarus? He is a poor man, reduced to begging, whose body was covered in sores. He was hungry. He was aching. And the comfort he received was of dogs licking his wounds for him. Unlike in other parables, and unlike the rich man, he is given a name. His name means one God has helped. In having a name, we are confronted with his humanity. We are invited to look at him and see his pain. Many of the first followers of Jesus were people like Lazarus, or people one step away from being people like Lazarus. They knew his pain. They saw his humanity. They could look at him and see his reality because it was familiar. They also knew the ways other people looked away from them and worked not to see them. They knew people wanted them to be invisible so that they could go on their merry ways. In a conversation I once witnessed, a person who had recently been housed was asked about the best way to respond to people begging on the street. While only one opinion, hers has stayed with me. She said it mattered much less to her if people gave money or not, but mattered a lot if they looked at her and acknowledged her. She often felt invisible and dehumanized, and someone responding when she spoke mattered a whole lot. Lazarus, I'm thinking, knew what that was like. Who was the rich man? We know he was rather seriously rich and had 5 brothers. We know that he didn't see Lazarus. Not in the beginning of the story, nor in the end. He thought Lazarus was disposable. He thought Lazarus should be sent to do his bidding. Lazarus should be sent to soothe him. Lazarus should be sent to warn his brothers. Not warn everyone, mind you, just his brothers. As Debbie Thomas, theologian and writer of Journey with Jesus, puts it. But here's the scariest part of the story for me. Even after death, the rich man fails to see Lazarus. Privilege just clings to him, even in Hades. Though he piously calls on Father Abraham, he refuses to see Lazarus as anything other than an errand boy. Bring me water. Go warn my brothers. No wonder Abraham tells him that the chasm separating the two realms is too great to cross. Let's be clear. God is not the one who builds the chasm. We do that all by ourselves. That is a scary part. But the things separating us from seeing each other's humanity are so powerful that they could remain even beyond our deaths. When I stop myself from having an instantaneous defensive reaction to this parable, I can see that it has some powerful truths. It rejects the world's hierarchies and humanizes everyone. Similarly, it challenges the assumption about who is good or worthy. For those who are living in poverty, it shows them that they were seen in their full humanity. For those not living in poverty, it makes people who live in poverty visible. It also makes clear that the rich man may have been rich, but he was definitely poor in understanding. Finally, we are reminded that this is not a new teaching brought by Jesus, but the essence of the Hebrew Bible spoken in a slightly different way. Now, I'm always grateful for reminders like those, but I do want to point out what I don't think we should take from this parable. I do not think that it should lead us to condemning others to hell. I do not think that this should lead us to feel complacent about this world, assuming that whatever is wrong here will be fixed in the next. I do not think we should dismiss the rich man as heartless without looking at who in the world we try not to see. And finally, I do not think we should use this parable as permission to dismiss anyone as other. Not the rich man, not Lazarus, and not anyone else either. One of the great costs of a theology that includes hell is the idea that the division between good and bad is between people, instead of accepting that all of us are good people and bad people and trying to work with God to maximize the good. That is, a theology of hell makes space for us to dehumanize and other some of God's beloveds. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, said, "If your heart is with my heart, give me your hand." He understood the difference between disagreements about details and implementation and disagreements about what matters in the world. He feared that people would let little things divide them instead of working together on the things that really matter. Similarly, my colleague, Rabbi Matt Cutler, has invited fellow members of Schenectady Clergy Against Hate to speak this weekend about divisions in our society and how to not let them live in our hearts. We have an election cycle coming up, and as he said, intense rhetoric is only exacerbating the tensions. We are in a unique role to help de-escalate the tensions that surely will grow in intensity as the midterm elections grow closer. And he didn't even know about this parable. This weekend, Rabbi Cutler will remind his congregation that every voice matters and no one should be dismissed, that there's a need to respect each other's character, which means not speaking of or to one another in anger, and finally, that we are all on the same journey. And I have to admit that I struggle with attempts at peace or unity that do so at the expense of the vulnerable or minoritized. And I think there are real differences in vision for our country, ones that include very different perspectives on, say, Lazarus and the rich man. I think those are the sorts of differences that matter too. And I think that those whose values are different from mine also have reasons why they think their system is best overall. They are also on this journey called life. They are also worthy of respect and being heard. Not the sort of respect that is obedience, the sort of respect that honors humanity. I don't have to agree with someone or with their values to find them worthy a full humanity, care, access to health care, enough food to eat, and respect. Divisions between us make space for hate. Dismissing someone because of a different point of view makes space for hate. Even dismissing someone for a different set of values makes space for hate. But I ask, what about the times when someone else's point of view is one that, say, dismisses the humanity of others? For me, the answer comes from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's sermon, Love Your Enemies. I mean, it also goes back to Jesus, but I like how Dr. King says it, and I will say this entire sermon is worthy of reading regularly. Dr. King says, there's a final reason that I think Jesus says, love your enemies. It is this, that love has within it a redemptive power. And there's a power there that eventually transforms individuals. That's why Jesus says, love your enemies. Because if you hate your enemies, you have no way to redeem and transform your enemies. But if you love your enemies, you will discover that at the very root of love is the power of redemption. You just keep loving people and keep loving them even though they're mistreating you. Here's the person who is a neighbor, and this person is doing something wrong to you, and all of that. Just keep being friendly to that person. Keep loving them. Don't do anything to embarrass them. Just keep loving them, and they can't stand it too long. Oh, they react in many ways in the beginning. They react with bitterness because they're mad because you love them like that. They react with guilt feelings, and sometimes they'll hate you a little more at that transition period, but just keep loving them. And by the power of your love, they will break down under the load. That's love, you see. It is redemptive, and this is why Jesus says love. There's something about love that builds up and is creative. There's something about hate that tears down and is destructive. Love your enemies. I wonder what would have resolved the parable. Perhaps the rich man seeing Lazarus as a fellow human, another person beloved by God and in care of need. Maybe that would have looked like giving him a blanket, or inviting him to a feast, or cleaning his wounds, or offering him a job, or just letting the table scraps actually fall to him. Or maybe it would have looked like welcoming him into the household for care. And I know that would have meant that another person would have replaced Lazarus at the gate, maybe 2 or 10 if the act of generosity was known, because a single act of mercy doesn't create social change and prevent people from being poor. But until the humanity of the rich and the poor can be seen together, the will to change society can't be created either. And a pragmatic suggestion as well, maybe use social media less between now and the election. It's designed to create division, and we want to create space for love. Thanks be to God, the God of love. Amen.